Good morning. I'm very glad to be here at the York University at the Harriet Tubman Institute. I'm Marta Scaglioni. I'm currently holding a research position at the University of Milan-Bicocca in Italy, and I'm working in the frame of a project called Shadows of Slavery in West Africa and Beyond, an historical anthropology. And I'm here to interview Professor Annie Bunting, who is the principal investigator of the Conjugal Slavery in War project.
Thanks very much, Marta. I'm really happy to be here and to talk to you about our shared interests. As Marta said, my name is Annie Bunting. I'm an associate professor of law and society here at York University. I teach in the graduate program in socio-legal studies, and I'm the associate director here at the Harriet Tubman Institute.
So we are quite interested in knowing how did your interest in slavery develop, and what is your positioning in the frame of the general literature on slavery, and what do you think the legacy of previous scholars working on slavery affect your current job and work?
It's a really interesting question. My training is in law, so my doctorate is actually on international women's rights, examining early age at marriage as an international women's rights issue, in particular in northern Nigeria. So my first engagement with slavery studies and histories of slavery concerned the ways in which colonial administrators and missionaries had framed early age at marriage as a problem that needed to be solved in northern Nigeria in particular, but the Sokoto Caliphate in general. So I had some, knowledge of and interaction with histories of slavery in the region, but I would never have called myself a slavery scholar, and even today I'm reluctant to claim that expertise. So that was in the late 1990s. If we move forward a decade, I was working with a coalition of women's rights activists on monitoring the prosecution of gender crimes at the International Criminal Tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. And there, what we noticed was that there was a lot of discussion about sexual slavery as a crime against humanity. And the debate then arose around whether forced marriage or enslavement for the purposes of forced marriage ought to be charged, ought to be indicted as a separate crime against humanity. And there I had to engage directly with theories of slavery, histories of enslavement, and the ways in which international law had treated slavery. And I'm very fortunate, of course, to be at York University with Professor Paul Lovejoy. And when I was putting together an initial grant for funding to explore the socio-legal dimensions of forced marriage and war, I approached Professor Lovejoy, and we had never met. As I was doing research in northern Nigeria, people would always say, "Oh, you're from Canada. Oh, you're from York. You must know Professor Lovejoy." And I would say, "I know of Professor Lovejoy. I know Professor Lovejoy's work. I do not know Professor Lovejoy." So then we had coffee, and the rest is history, as they say. So we started collaborating on this project around working with both historians of slavery, women's rights activists, and researchers and frontline practitioners concerned with the implications of forced marriage in war and for survivors of enslavement for conjugal association in the post-conflict situation. So I'm very indebted to people like Claire Robertson, Martin Klein, Paul Lovejoy, Richard Roberts, Benjamin Lawrence, Benedetta Rossi, and others who have done such rich historical anthropology in this area, because what we're trying to do in our project is put the current phenomenon in terms of conflict situations into historical perspective.
You were trained in law studies, so how did you end up working on African studies? Was it by chance, or?
I would say it was partly by chance and partly by interest. So in the 1980s, as a law student, I had traveled with the World University Service of Canada for 2 months to Zimbabwe, actually, looking at refugee policy on the Mozambican border. And there I developed a deep and abiding interest at that time, it was immigration and refugee policies. When I was doing my doctoral work, I had the good fortune to meet Abdullahian Naim, who's a Sudanese, now Sudanese American scholar of international human rights. And he, at the time, was the head of Africa Rights for Human Rights Watch, and invited me into a project there. And again, I've always been interested in practices that are described as violations of international women's rights in particular, but then defended by communities as important to cultural reproduction. And it's at those contests over the meaning of particular practices, whether in terms of cultural reproduction or violation of women's rights, that has always been an interest for me. So whether it's early age at marriage or other practices. So there, it's then working with a coalition of other concerned feminists and researchers. For the last 25 years, it's landed on African studies.
Could you tell us what the project Conjugal Slavery in War is about and how was it born?
The Conjugal Slavery in War project was born out of a concern about the representation of experiences of survivors of conflict situations in law. So it actually was born out of the Special Court for Sierra Leone's decision to find forced marriage as a separate heading of a crime against humanity. And this then provoked a number of us to think about whether that heading captured the experiences of survivors of enslavement for the purposes of forced marriage. And in doing that, we also wanted to put that into historical context and then think about reparations for survivors in a post-conflict situation. The project then has 4 themes. The first concerns histories of slavery. The second theme is masculinities and femininities, and we examine there the ways in which expectations around gender are mobilized for the purposes of forced labor and war, and the reproduction of coercive relationships in conflict situations. The third theme concerns children born of war, and interestingly, while we talk a lot about children born of rape or children born in conflict situations or in captivity, in fact, there's not a lot of scholarship that's looking at their experiences and asking what children who are now young adults about their sense of belonging in a post-conflict family or community. And again, we're not asking them about what their particular needs are. The scholarship has tended to attach children's experience to the needs of their mothers. And the fourth theme, no surprise, is around justice mechanisms. And here we're, again, coming out of our previous work monitoring the prosecution of gender crimes. We're interested in contributing to knowledge around legal indictments and trying to think about and think critically about the place of international justice in a post-conflict situation. So is the International Criminal Tribunal's International Criminal Court in The Hague, for example, having a positive impact on opening space for debate in a post-conflict situation? Or are there ways in which those cases may be shutting down space for reparations and meaningful social repair?
You are collecting life histories, so how do life history contribute to the general understanding of slavery and of the project, and also in terms of methodology?
So in our project, not only are we trying to work comparatively across 6 countries, we're also trying to work comparatively across time periods and also in a very robustly interdisciplinary way. So we're trying to actually mobilize a variety of methodologies to bring new knowledge and new theoretical insights into slavery studies, but in particular, what is, the experiences around enslavement and conflict situations. So the way that this fits more generally into slavery studies and in terms of methodology is that the life histories piece fits into a broader set of inquiries in order to try and shed light on new knowledge in this area. So for example, one of the things that we're learning is that we don't have a lot of life histories in terms of the male experience or male perspective on forced relationships in war. And in very hierarchical, coercive environments such as the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda, in fact, it's a more complicated set of masculinities that need to be explored there. Or in a situation of Liberia or Sierra Leone, again, where marriage was used as a mechanism, an institution indeed, to mobilize labor, we haven't got a full picture of what that meant for men to be ordered to take a wife, or in fact to have a wife taken away from them as punishment. So the life histories allows us a way of having a more complete history of the experiences in war. At the same time, we don't want to leave it at the level of one narrative or 50 narratives or life histories alone. We're also trying to gather from those a more structural analysis in terms of, as I just said, forced labor, forced reproduction in times of conflict.
Law is a very important dimension of your project, and in a situation where slavery is now abolished worldwide, what are the legal definitions of its legacy? I'm thinking about sexual slavery, forced marriage, and so on.
It's interesting when, as someone trained in law, and perhaps you see this as someone trained in history, it also allows you to be most critical of law or history as one lens to understand experience. So the way that I think about the importance of law in this project and more generally in understanding social phenomena is that it's just one piece of insight into a larger phenomenon. So the legal definition of slavery from the 1926 Convention and from the 1956 Supplementary Convention allows us to think about and be quite precise in our understanding of what exactly meets the legal definition of slavery. This is very different than what might meet our understanding of a rhetorical use of slavery or enslavement. So the 1926 definition was also expanded by the Rome Statute that established the International Criminal Court. And so in addition to the powers attaching to ownership over a person, the Rome Statute added, or similar deprivations of liberty. And in the work by Jean Alain and others, they have tried to think very carefully about what those constituent elements mean in terms of practice and indeed in terms of conflict situations. So in our project, we're quite careful to use a legal definition of slavery, not to overstretch its meaning, not to try and capture too many things in its legal definition, because for us as a team and for me as someone who's legally trained, it's very important that we not overstretch or try and just use a term rhetorically that then loses its actual strength. I would also say that that this project was also born exactly at that nexus of the question that you just asked, which is that what's the difference between an experience of sexual slavery, an experience of enslavement for some other purpose, and forced marriage? And what is it when we're looking at the institution of marriage and put it alongside the institution of slavery, even in a situation where slavery is illegal? Just because slavery is illegal doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, of course, as we know. So in the project that we're looking at, it's also been very important to look historically at the relationship between marriage and slavery, the differences and similarities in the institutions, and in war also to really try and push this question about why is it that the institution and the understanding of marriage was mobilized for certain purposes, for labor in particular.
And your project also comprises politics in the terms of slavery reparation, but it seems to tackle slavery reparation more in addressing the individuals and the groups' involvement and responsibility for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and so on. What is your idea of a good, efficient slavery reparation which is not paternalistic, like sometimes we see anti-slavery campaigns?
I think this is a really important question in our field, both in our project and more generally in the field. And Joel Quirk has contributed significantly to try to challenge paternalistic understandings of reparations programs, not just reparations, but also a critique of anti-slavery activism more broadly. And in our project, we sidestep some of those controversies because we're really more narrowly focused, as you said, on individuals and communities and reparations in a post-conflict situation that may or may not be attached to understandings of slavery. So it's not required to mobilize a particular anti-slavery advocacy in order to put in place an effective reparations program. Where the controversy does land, however, which might be even more heated, is on the politics of the International Criminal Court in Africa. So the Victims' Trust Fund, for example, from the International Criminal Court, and more generally the court and its indictments in Uganda and in Kenya and elsewhere is very controversial. So one of the things that we heard recently in Uganda is that a lot of victims and community members and families of victims are wondering, well, will everyone benefit from the Victims Trust Fund? How are reparations going to be rolled out from the International Criminal Court in a way that's fair? Is it only those people who give testimony? Is it only those people who are named as victims? So I think, our project is trying to have an impact more broadly on reparations programs, and often this means calling upon governments and not the International Criminal Court for effective and meaningful reparations programs. And this can range from everything from an apology from the government for lack of protection, that's one of the demands of victims in Uganda, to compensation and reparations for lost cattle, to other symbolic things, to very financial needs such as school fees, ongoing health concerns. There are a number of people in most post-conflict situations where we work that have bullets remaining in their body, for example, or there may be fistula that need repair, or there may be psychosocial support. And without financial or other psychosocial services, those needs are not going to be met. And for us, those are the more those holistic approaches to reparations are not only less paternalistic, but are also more effective than some of the other programs we've seen.
You just came from Uganda. How was your experience there?
So in Uganda, we hosted what we think was probably the first survivors exchange between men and women who are returnees from the Lord's Resistance Army. And they most have been, as you know, returned for more than a decade. And what we tried to do in the first 2 days of a closed workshop was to set up a conversation and a space for exchange between men and women who had similar but obviously very different experiences. And then there was a 3-day open conference on coercive relationships in war. And what was fascinating throughout the 5 days of the Summer Institute was to really have a conversation that was not just interdisciplinary, but also, that the survivors really spoke on their own behalf, contributed all the way through the 3 days. And I think everyone came out at the end of the 5 having learned something, whether you were a historian of slavery, an anthropologist working in Uganda or working in Sierra Leone. The other thing I would say about Uganda is in relation to your question about reparations, the earlier question, is that I think it's important for us to remember that regardless of how much time has passed after a conflict is over, there are often so many unmet needs that have really not yet been explored, let alone addressed in a meaningful way. So in Uganda, we have a situation where the transitional justice program is sitting on a desk, has been drafted 3, 4, 5 times, and remains not in force. So for survivor communities, this is completely unacceptable, and they continue to call on the government of Uganda to put in place a transitional justice program, reparations programs, and to meet the needs of children born in captivity, their parents, and others. And indeed, there are still people who are missing or who are presumed dead, but their families don't know. So for the families, again, that's another area that we often don't talk about when we think about conflicts and reparations. What about those families whose children have not returned and they have no idea what their fate was? The other thing I would say about the conference and the Summer Institute in Uganda is that it requires, in terms of a model for exchange between men and women across countries and across time periods, I would say that we learned how important it is to have long-term, ongoing relationships with community-based organizations, because it's those partners who are there day in, day out, who support the victims both in preparation for participation in something like this, and then once there may have been issues that arise that were not anticipated, they're the ones who are going to be doing the ongoing support.
Slavery, we know, is a very sensitive issue, and it's difficult to tackle it, especially with people who have been victims of slavery. Sometimes there is a kind of culture of silence and covering it. And also, slavery can be also very nuanced. So how do you address it with the person really experiencing slavery, and how do you rely on the local understandings of slavery? And is it also difficult to speak about these things, or have you had problems during your fieldwork in Uganda?
So perhaps I can speak to this complexity of the use of the term slavery, sexual slavery, conjugal slavery, not just in the Ugandan context, but in some of the other countries where we work, because it's definitely a problematic and a challenge for us in this project and for others who work in this area. So one of the things that is interesting is that the term sexual slavery has been used more frequently to describe long-term sexual exploitation of women in the context of war. And what we learned in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Uganda, and elsewhere was that one of the harms that women talked about was having the status of wife ascribed to them, and that was a particular harm in addition to the sexual exploitation. And so it was important to them as survivors, back to your point about life histories, that it was important to them to articulate that as an additional harm or something that was not captured under the heading of sexual slavery. And in some ways this raised other issues. So some people would say, well, if you're then talking about forced marriage, then does that increase the threshold of marriage without consent in peace times? In other words, are we then criminalizing as slavery forced marriage or marriage without consent?
Yeah, or is there the risk of normalizing other kind of relationship?
And the flip is also exactly true, that it could normalize other relationships or not problematize violence in other contexts. So what that was one of the reasons that in 2012, as a group, we thought that it was important to make sure that you had enslavement for the purposes of forced marriage included in the description of this set of harms that people go through in times of war, because it was clear that it's a process and that it's not the marriage that's legitimate. You're not talking about a legitimate marriage in customary law. So we heard a number of things in reaction to the Charles Taylor decision with the use of the term conjugal slavery. So rather than using the term forced marriage, which can make it seem like a normalized marriage or customary marriage, the Taylor decision in the court had decided to use conjugal slavery. And here what's interesting there is that people find it very cumbersome, they're not really sure what it means, but also, as you said, the use of the term slavery is very controversial, and so that means that someone is a slave in that situation. And for many people, slavery is an historical phenomenon and one that isn't actually currently happening even in wars in Sierra Leone, former wars in Sierra Leone or in the former conflict in Uganda. So there's a certain distancing indeed for those who are survivors of those experiences from the term. There can be, not always, there can be a distancing. As someone once said, like, who wants to be referred to as a sex slave? But also who wants to be referred to as a conjugal slave. So, and that's from the women's perspective. From the men's perspective, who've either gone through amnesty processes or who themselves were abducted as child soldiers, there's another set of complexities that we have to think about. Because by criminalizing that, whether it's enslavement for forced marriage or sexual slavery, you are also, there's a perpetrator, or there may be multiple perpetrators. And in that situation, when you're looking at rebuilding in a post-conflict situation, and the men may actually be in a situation where they've been granted amnesty, and they're trying to actually have relationships with their children who were born in captivity with women with whom they may have been for 5 or 6 years in captivity. This raises a whole host of other challenges, not just from legal definition, but in terms of post-conflict reparations.
There is a debate, like a theoretical and legal debate, on all the distinctions between forced marriage, coerced marriage. I don't even know exactly what I'm kind of confused, and sexual slavery. Can you just give us a very broad legal definition?
I think one of the important things for us to remember is that a prohibition on forced marriage is found in international human rights law, not in our 1926 Slavery Convention. So the threshold for what it constitutes a forced marriage is lower than in law than what constitutes slavery. So the powers attaching to ownership over another person is the definition of slavery. That is not the same thing as forced marriage, which is one of the reasons I was reluctant to support or endorse the use of the term forced marriage in international criminal law, because it does confuse us. It is confusing because we have a concept of marriage without consent in times of relative peace. And that's not the same thing as what we're talking about in war or what we're talking about that would meet the definition of slavery. So the 1956 Supplementary Convention on Slavery includes reference to marriage. And there it states that if a girl is sold or is transferred or is inherited, in the case a girl or a woman is transferred to another person from one husband to another or inherited on widowhood, then those meet the definition of slavery. So it is important for us to remember that they did conceptualize that certain forms of marriage, as I said, sold, transferred, or inherited, meets the definition of slavery.
So that's why you chose the term like conjugal slavery instead of forced marriage in your project. Because, for example, I think like forced marriages are found like if we stick to this definition, we would apply to many cases. Exactly. For example, I'm thinking about the Jewish communities inheriting the widow of one's brother, exactly. And it's something. And how does the girl's consent like come into play with these things?
So I think that we. Again, I like to think of cultures of consent and also ideas around personhood and ways of becoming full autonomous adults. And oftentimes, as we wrote, as Richard Roberts and Benjamin Lawrence and I wrote in our collection, is that we do have to really think deeply about our assumptions about individualism and consent and ways of becoming full adults. So the consent in terms of forced marriage and the consent of the spouses is very important. And if there is a lack of consent, it meets the definition of forced marriage. In terms of slavery, again, that's a lower threshold than slavery. In terms of why we chose the term conjugal slavery, perhaps it wasn't a wise choice, but that comes from the Charles Taylor decision at the International Criminal Court. And we did want to problematize the use of marriage to try and question whether we wanted to reproduce the very institution and the normalizing of the institution in war that people found so problematic in their own experience. So we both wanted to distinguish that this is actually a process of enslavement for the purposes of forced labor, forced reproductive labor in times of war that ought to be distinguished from times of relative peace. But also we were in communication with, we were trying to think critically about the term conjugal slavery.
So thank you for your time and for very inspiring answers. And just the last question, what are your next projects? What are you up to publish or to write?
Well, thanks very much, Marta. It was a real pleasure to talk to you. Joel Quirk and I have a forthcoming collection called Contemporary Slavery, Political Practice and Popular Rhetoric that's coming out in June with the University of British Columbia Press. And we're looking forward to sharing that. There are a lot of really excellent chapters that critically assess the mobilization of the iconography and rhetoric of anti-slavery activism in contemporary debates. And the Conjugal Slavery and War Project seems to occupy most corners of my brain and most minutes of my day. But I'm also working on a project. My long-term interest is around controversy around age and marriage. So I'm working on a project on Syrian refugees in Lebanon, and another on violence by peacekeepers in Eastern Congo.
You're very busy.